because everything that had to do with authority was always, when I was very young, was not to be trusted. Whether my father was not killed by the Japanese, he was killed by other people, and so who do you trust? And then later, the Japanese started killing us all, and I lost cousins to the Japanese in February of 1945. I lost an aunt and several first cousin and several cousins in a couple of weeks in Manila, as they were just out on a rampage slaughtering people.
How were you able to survive that? Were you there at the time?
Yes, I was in Manila. But then after my father was killed, I went into concentration camp with my mother, my sister and I. So I was in concentration camp with her.
How long were you there for?
About 9 months. And what happened with the Japanese, the first forces that went into the Philippines were shock troops. Then came a different regime, and they were more interested in this co-East Asia prosperity sphere, which is what they called this new regime they wanted to impose in Asia. And so a more benevolent approach. They were trying to win over the people, as it were.
Right.
And so a lot of Americans who had been in concentration camp, women especially, not men, were allowed out. My mother was one of them. There was a case, a very famous case in Manila. There was a woman who had been one of the chief people of the telephone company in Manila. When the Japanese invaded, she was put in the concentration camp, and they couldn't run the telephone company without this woman. In those days, it was all switchboards and everything. So she actually had a day pass, and she would go out she was in Santo Tomas concentration camp in Manila, and she would be able to go out and actually live in town, and then had to go back and report back to the concentration camp.
Really?
In order to make the telephone system
run.
So
she stayed in the concentration camp at night?
Yeah. In my case, in my mother's case, she was let out, and then we moved to Manila because I had a lot of a couple of my father's brothers were there, and a couple of his sisters.
But initially, you didn't go to the concentration camp because of your father, but now that your father was dead, they dragged you in there?
Yeah, I was staying with my father, and then when my father and brother were killed, they took us and put us in with my mother, and we stayed in concentration camp with my mother. After she was released and we were released, we moved to Manila, and then she tried to obscure the fact because she didn't speak English she didn't speak English like an American. She had a strong accent, and of course spoke both Tagalog and Visayan, two dialects. So she sort of melded in to the population and stayed away from the Japanese. And we managed to stay out of problem because later, when the war turned against the Japanese, the benevolence changed entirely, and things got pretty serious, pretty difficult for everybody.
But tell us how many people were killed in the Philippines, because it's an outrageous amount of people, but I don't think a lot of people really know about it.
The sum total that I read in a book that I read, a history book on the subject, was about 1,190,000 people that were actually killed during the entire occupation period.
Why do you think that we don't hear very much about that?
Not enough has been talked about what happened in Asia at all. I mean, you can talk about the Filipinos and a million Filipinos that died, but I've seen numbers as high as 20 million Chinese who were killed during their occupation. Now, they went through a much longer occupation. It started in 1931 when the Japanese went into Manchuria, and then in 1937 when they went into mainland China and took that over. And in Nanking, for example, in February of 1945, when the Japanese went on a rampage and they started executing all civilians on what they called the battlefield, which was Manila, about 100,000 or so people were murdered on the streets of Manila, and about another 150,000 or so were pretty badly wounded. In Nanking in 1937, December 37, the numbers range anywhere from 250 to 300,000 were slaughtered in about a 3-week period. So the numbers, and we don't know about that. There have been books that have been written about it. There's a wonderful one called The Rape of Nanking by Iris Chang, whose grandmother had been in Nanking, and so she did the similar thing that I'm trying to do now, is sort of recompile and put all these pieces together again for her family.
And why are you trying to do that?
Well, I'm trying to do it first, it started off as a project for my sister. Then when my daughter was in college, she was asked to do a story about the Holocaust, and she went to the Holocaust Museum. And I just, here in Los Angeles, and she started talking about some of the things she saw there, and she didn't see anything or very little about what happened in Asia. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, wow, she needs to understand what happened there, because, you know, 65, or I've seen numbers from 50 to 65 million people died during World War II. So she needed to learn a little bit about what happened there to understand what happened to her family, because she lost her grandparents and great-grandparents
right.
as a consequence of the war.
But proportionately, are there more Jews that got killed compared to their race, or Chinese that got killed compared to theirs?
Proportionally, what Hitler did to the Jews in Europe was, you can't describe it.
And that's why we hear so much about that.
Of course. Well, also I think they've done a wonderful job, and they should keep reminding everybody.
Right.
You cannot
Absolutely.
allow the world to forget the monstrosity of anti-Semitism and what happened in the Holocaust.
Absolutely.
It has to be, our memories have to be refreshed on a daily basis. But I think what happened after World War II, all of a sudden, the problem was no longer Nazis, but it was the communists. Mao Zedong started taking over all of China. The Russians started taking over all of Eastern Europe. So the United States became more interested in rebuilding Japan and didn't want to talk about anything that happened, because they didn't want to have to explain how they were now all of a sudden pouring money into what had been a former enemy. I mean, what they did was perfectly justified. I'm not criticizing it. Perfectly a good thing to do. But unfortunately, in the process, nothing was done to remind people of the atrocities of what happened in Asia. And they really need to, the story needs to be told. There have been a few odds and ends.
So what are you recommending? Or what do you think they should do?
I think there are books that I'm trying to write. I think certainly a starting place is to look at what happened to China. Iris Chang's book is a wonderful place to start, to discuss just what happened in Nanking and explore further some of...
But I think it's also important that people know about not knowing, because if they don't know that they don't know, if that makes sense. I mean, they may not even know that this thing exists, and so if they don't know it exists, how are they going to want to find anything out about it?
I think that's precisely the point. I think that too often when we think of Germany, it's about Nazis and Adolf Hitler, as if he were just one person. But Joseph Stalin probably killed more Russians than Hitler killed Germans, including German Jews and all other kinds of people that he did. But we don't really know about that. Certainly what happened in China under the Japanese and then later under Mao Zedong is also monstrous. Tens of millions of people were killed between the Japanese and under the early communist regime, and various great leap forwards under Mao Zedong. So I think that the world needs to understand how that can happen, because if we don't understand...
How can that happen?
Well, for one thing, concentrating, allowing government to have that kind of life and death power over individuals, where the individual has no rights. You had no rights in the Soviet Union. You had no rights under the Japanese, certainly. You had no rights in Germany. You had no rights in China under Mao. And whoever was in charge decided to do with you, including kill you. And for example, we have movies. We had a movie recently where the so-called samurai warrior was glorified, the last samurai, whatever it was. Well, a samurai could walk up to somebody and lop off his head, provided he wasn't another samurai. But I mean, some ordinary citizen in the street, and it looked at him cross-eyed, and he could just simply lop off his head because he disturbed him. And that same kind of samurai cult is what pervaded in the officer class among the Japanese military, and which enabled them to feel that they were entitled to just start executing